So if you all came to sixth period world studies, you would see me and a guy named Jackson Potter talking about imperialism, colonialism, and resistance. And this whole notion around how do we actually locate ourselves in that ability to not only resist, but to transform. What is the responsibility of everyone in that classroom in making an informed decision and actually passing down the information to folks who come behind us and distribute that information currently to the people who could use it to actually change their condition? And how do we do that? So we actually developed a unit, and it's probably, I know that this is being taped, so if the feds come, I told y'all, all right? And I'm not banking on, if, I'm banking on the when, right? Because that's the time that we're living in. And we actually, one of the first units that we actually taught this year was on cocaine. And some of y'all might look like, whoa, right? That's pretty spicy, right? But cocaine, meaning a different thing. Cocaine actually being keyed into survival. Cocaine being tied into drug cartels that actually run particular streets in Chicago. Not gangs, drug cartels. Sinaloas, Michoacanos, right? Actually, a notion of trafficking being very centralized through the city. But again, how do we even come to this space? So we do what Eric Kleinenberg calls a social autopsy of cocaine. These are not, and this is always the assumption, right? That these are the best and brightest students. No, I got students with D's, F's, make a decision all the time between whether or not they're gonna drop out, right? And being real about that. And what we do after every unit is we have our students evaluate the unit. And we ask them, what do we need to do to improve the next unit? So our planning is very different. It's not necessarily the sequential throughout the year planning, but it's a very timed piece where we actually have to get their feedback in order to create the next space that we will actually venture into. We have a general theme, but then we actually engage it from particular spaces. And why do we do this? Not to, because this is another thing about social justice. A lot of times people do this stuff because it's cute, right? So you can be on NPR, right? Or be in the paper. I mean, some people are motivated like that. But this whole thing is, we have to make this situation real. Chicago is part of the world. Chicago is in a particular part of the world that is affected in a particular way that's actually coming down on you as young folks, myself included. So how do I actually make a way to actually demonstrate that I'm in solidarity with them, right? And some of the things that you all have been doing for the last 30 plus years, right? Making yourself accessible, making sure that the policies that come forward are not ones that will further marginalize your students. But I think now, especially for folks who are in colleges of teacher ed, for people who are in K-12 institutions, for people at universities, we're gonna have to get into some real fighting. And I mean some real fighting. We can't sit by and capitulate. We can't sit by and say, that's how it is. Because if we let this thing go the way that it's going, you might not have colleges of education in 10 years. Now again, I'm not putting that out as language of crisis. I'm challenging us to engage. And we can say some things. We can actually push forward in some indictments on colleges of ed. Because we do this stuff, that scope, sequence, classroom management dance, that's just terrible. And some of us has actually sat through teacher ed programs and said, this shit is not going to work. It's just not. And whoever wrote this has had no contact with the young folks that I'm engaging in the day-to-day. I have to be honest about that. Don't squirm. This is real, right? And we have to be clear about, knowing that to be the case, what are we doing to change that reality? Because too many times our students slip through the cracks. And if we're not clear about how this thing is stood historically and in the current state, then we won't be able to actually make new suggestions. And one of the things that we can do, and I'm speaking particularly to folks who are in colleges of teacher ed, is actually, instead of, because we do this thing with the rock star teacher, that's a problem. What we can really do is support those teachers in years 1 through 3. Because that's when they leave. Right? And if folks, and this is what we know nationally that if teachers stay past year 3, they're going to stay to years 5 to 10. Right? But again, we have to challenge this thing of things. We have to challenge historically how some of that teaching has been horrifically racist, horrifically classist, horrifically homophobic. And then actually identify examples of ways in which to engage that challenge that paradigm. So today I'm coming to stand in solidarity with you all in terms of challenging this way of thinking around these young folks. Because we put them in this space and we don't trust them. Right? And we wrongly position ourselves as saviors. And I got this thing, and this is probably gonna get me in trouble. But I say this thing in my classroom. Sometimes I kill missionaries. And what do I mean by that? I don't want nobody coming in talking about they just here to help. I am not looking for that. And I say that explicitly because that's the thing. Oh, there's just such a problem with them and they just need to be fixed. Nobody needs to be fixed. These are the young folks who actually have the potential to change how we think, talk, and act. If we listen and pay attention to them, we can do some things. I only want folks, and I go with there's a Maori quote that says, if you've come to help, you're wasting your time. But if you see your human condition as bound up with mine, we can work together. And if I see my condition as bound with my students, if I'm acting in solidarity with them, then I'm not making this decision or talking about them as pathologized beasts. Because if you read some of these reports, you think you're reading about monkeys. And if anybody teaches at a KIPP institution, my fault. But I need to say this. I can teach a rat, a dog, and a monkey how to get a 22 on ACT. I can do it. But what we need to be doing is engaging their human condition. Because that is the educational project. Tests are nice. Test scores are even nicer. If one of my students this year is going to Harvard, and we got this back and forth conversation. All right, you going to the big house, what you gonna do? So we've actually created a plan for him to come back, right? We want to be explicit because there's nothing worse than an educated fool. And sometimes we can breed that. But how do we eliminate it? So here's some things, and again, I only say this because this is what I'm struggling with. These are the conversations that I'm having with myself every day, not let alone my colleagues. These are the spaces that are actually pushing me to think about this differently. These are the things that I make terrible and awful mistakes with. But at the same time, I know there is the possibility to do something different. And in doing that differently, I have to be prepared to get in trouble. Right? I'm not fearful of when they're going to come. Right? I know they're coming. In fact, I know they're here. Right? So that's not going to deter me from doing what I need to do. And one of those things is, how do we now in this time support the folks who are actually engaging this work? So that first thing around teachers in years 1 through 3, we need to be very intentional about their support. For folks who are actually in K-12 classrooms, it is critically important for you to find the people who are actually engaging in those justice projects in your area or actually in your district. Your ability to stand together is critical, because now you're actually being challenged in very discrete ways. And we need to have groups of people who actually are able to situate themselves and provide those challenges, not just with their rhetoric, but with what they actually do in their classroom. So now, this race to the top piece, and this is interesting. Have you all seen this race to the top? Well, now they actually have changed the measures of achievement. I thought that was really interesting to actually look at it as achievement in terms of what we currently know about achievement, is that achievement changes over time. But still, in this competition model, there's a penalty for not demonstrating changes over time, which is always the problem. We've never asked the question in terms of how a struggling school is supported. The only way we have in competition models is to close it. But can we support that institution? So we have groups like the New York Collective of Radical Educators. We have folks like the Caucus of Rank and File Educators. We got folks on the West Coast, Teachers for Social Justice San Francisco, or the Association of Raza Educators. We got the Raza Studies Institute in Tucson, Arizona. We have a group of social justice educators in St. Louis and Milwaukee. We have Rethinking Schools. But now, how do we coalesce those efforts in supporting what folks do in classrooms? And in teacher ed, how do we create those spaces for folks to engage the realities of the communities and young folks that we're working in solidarity with? And as researchers, how do we change the current paradigm on what counts as quality teaching? And again, ask these very descriptive questions, because these are being challenged in ways that, again, I'm 38, so I haven't seen a whole lot. In fact, I kind of read the history of North Dakota Study Group, and I'm like, man, this thing started the year I was born, right? So it's a whole new paradigm. So this whole notion around how do we actually engage and challenge those ways when we understand that K-12 administrators and teachers often work under duress, whether it be No Child Left Behind, whether it be the college readiness standards, whether it be whatever state mandate is put forward in terms of what folks have to do in K-8. Another Chicago model that's actually moving nationally, and New York picked it up first. Benchmark grading. So in Chicago, we actually have the benchmark grades of 3rd, 6th, and 8th. We actually have to take an exit exam for each of those grades in order to pass to the next grade. In New York City, it's 2nd, 5th, and 7th. Now they actually are pushing this as a national model around this notion of achievement and demonstrating changes over time in the institution. So again, where are the sites of resistance? How do we support them? And can we get, more importantly, in K-12 space, can we get people off the fence? Because a lot of times when we talk to teachers, they want to do particular things, but they're scared. Scared of what? Being fired. I don't know if you all have seen these stories on New York City's Rubber Room. Yeah. I mean, I was wondering if they did that in Chicago, you would have a full-on riot. And that's just me being a Chicagoan and trusting our ability to get down, if you will. But this whole notion of how do we begin to support those spaces, and how are we intentional about supporting those spaces? So again, not just saying it in name, but if you're a teacher educator, that you're out there with your teachers who have come through your classroom. If you're in K-12, you're out there with families engaging those issues and concerns, right? If you're an administrator, you're not afraid to challenge central office around how they've actually determined what constitutes achievement. And this is what we need. And it can be done. I work with a principal who is a hell raiser, but he does it with a smile. And I was like, Chad, how do you do that? Right? And he's always like, look, I know I'm here to do other things. I got bigger work to do. And that bigger work is making sure that you all have the space to do what it is that you need to do. My job is to keep central office off your back. Period. And when I look at him all the time, I say, wow, Chad, you define a rider teacher. He'll say, hey, look, we got big work to do. I am not a savior. I'm struggling with this. Say, wow, man. And some of you all might not picture a 30-year-old openly gay man to say those things and mean them. And I only know he means them because he demonstrates it every day. And these are the type of things. So we're not looking for saviors. We're not looking for the highly lauded teacher. I'm actually looking for the folks who are willing to grind and engage this in ways that are not popular. Because what my students are facing is serious. And serious to the point that many of them I may not see tomorrow. In 5 years, I have buried 3 of my students. So I take this seriously. And I mean that because now the blind is on. We've looked at this veneer and we got all this rhetoric around achievement and high performance and quality. But now I'm challenging myself and us to dig a little deeper, to fight a little harder, to think, to organize, to be clear as to what we do and as to why. Because in the end, and I always think about this, somebody did it for us. And I'm clear about that. And I always think of my grandmother because she said something to me and I always laugh when I think about it. She said, and she calls me by my full name. She says, David Stovall. You a teacher, huh? I said, yes, ma'am. And she says, are you teaching them what they want or are you teaching the truth? I said, Grandma, who's they? She said, if you need to ask me that question, we have a problem. So that is my call and responsibility. But again, not in ways to be lauded, but to understand this is part of a larger struggle. And an important struggle now, because this is being used as a national platform. And that national platform is still playing on the desperations of families. And we have to interrupt it. I say this in my most sincere attempt to do it. I apologize if my comments appear jumbled. Sometimes going back and forth with this, you get into spaces in terms of balancing myself as a teacher, a classroom teacher, somebody who teaches at a university, and someone who's actually trying to develop spaces where I can support this larger movement for justice. And in the end, I am encouraged, but I will say, we have to step up our fight. And I hope that you all today and throughout the weekend can actually start to engage in ways to support folks who are doing this work on the ground. Because for every one of us in the room, we know 30 who's battling with this in very real ways. And when I leave here, I go right back to struggling with those concepts. But again, for the purpose of actually believing in my students' ability to change the human condition. And it can. And often it comes with a challenge, right? And if y'all ever came to my class, you will see, and if anybody's ever been a classroom teacher, some days are not the greatest, right? But I think every time my students say, Stovall, why we gotta do this? It is the most legitimate question they could ever pose. That to me is what they should be asking. And I say to them, yeah, y'all should be asking that. because we feed y'all a lot of garbage, right? And actually, now we're being encouraged to lie to you even more. But I've made a conscious decision to interrupt that. And they say, damn, Stovall, you about to get in trouble. I say, well, y'all, I'm already in trouble. But they made a couple of mistakes. One, they hired me. Two, they really messed up when they gave me tenure. Right? So now with those resources, I'm trying to get down. I'm trying to make it work. As my uncle says, I'm trying to make it do what it do in very definitive ways. But again, with this notion of justice, that which is determined as right and just by the communities who have witnessed and experienced injustice. Period. And I'm willing to work with whoever is willing to engage that, and understanding that this is not about being personally lauded, but about a much more serious program, because this is what our young folks are facing. So let me stop there, and I guess we can open it up for questions. I know you all got a busy schedule. I apologize, I'm gonna miss the party. You know, my students always talk about, dang, Stovall, you like to kick it all the time. And I was like, hey, I'm a young person at heart. All right? So let's stop there and we can open up for questions.